Lawlessness, socialism, racism, pandemics, government overreach. Where's it all going? This week we're going to talk about the role that the 7 cultural mountains play in shaping culture. Stay tuned. How do I bring my faith to work? How do I tap into the power of God in my work-life call? Why am I going through this adversity? Is God mad at me? I'm Os Hillman, and I've been helping leaders like you answer these questions and more for over 30 years. That's what this podcast is all about. Let's learn and grow together. Welcome to TGIF, Today God is First.
If I were the devil, if I were the devil, if I were the prince of darkness, I'd want to engulf the whole world in darkness, and I'd have 1/3 of its real estate and 4/5 of its population, but I wouldn't be happy until I had seized the ripest apple on the tree, thee. So I'd set about, however necessary, to take over the United States. I'd subvert the churches first. I'd begin with a campaign of whispers. With the wisdom of a serpent, I would whisper to you as I whispered to Eve, do as you please. To the young, I would whisper that the Bible is a myth. I would convince them that man created God instead of the other way around. I would confide that what's bad is good and what's good is square. And the old I would teach to pray after me, Our Father, which art in Washington. And then I'd get organized. I'd educate authors in how to make lurid literature exciting so that anything else would appear dull and uninteresting. I'd threaten TV with dirtier movies and vice versa. I'd peddle narcotics to whom I could. I'd sell alcohol to ladies and gentlemen of distinction. I'd tranquilize the rest with pills. If I were the devil, I'd soon have families at war with themselves, churches at war with themselves, and nations at war with themselves, until each in its turn was consumed. And with promises of higher ratings, I'd have mesmerizing media fanning the flames. If I were the devil, I would encourage schools to refine young intellects, but neglect to discipline emotions. Just let those run wild. Until before you knew it, you'd have to have drug-sniffing dogs and metal detectors at every schoolhouse door. Within a decade, I'd have prisons overflowing. I'd have judges promoting pornography. Soon I could evict God from the courthouse, then from the schoolhouse, and then from the houses of Congress. And in his own churches, I would substitute psychology for religion and deify science. I would lure priests and pastors into misusing boys and girls and church money. If I were the devil, I'd make the symbol of Easter an egg and the symbol of Christmas a bottle. If I were the devil, I'd take from those who have and give to those who wanted until I had killed the incentive of the ambitious. And what'll you bet? I couldn't get whole states to promote gambling as the way to get rich. I would caution against extremes in hard work, in patriotism, in moral conduct. I would convince the young that marriage is old-fashioned, that swinging is more fun, that what you see on TV is the way to be. And thus I could undress you in public, and I could lure you into bed with diseases for which there is no cure. In other words, if I were the devil, I'd just keep right on doing what he's doing.
Hey, welcome to this week's podcast. You just watched a radio show that was put to video, 1964, by Paul Harvey. What an amazing video that is, that tells us where we are today. Little did we know that he was a prophet, in the media mountain. So today I want to talk to you about the 7 cultural mountains and the strategy for really impacting culture through the 7 cultural mountains. Today I'm going to be talking from some of the research I did for my books, Change Agent, Engaging Your Passion to Be the One Who Makes a Difference, and the Joseph Calling, 6 Stages to Discover, Navigate, and Fulfill Your Purpose. Both of these books were books I wrote around the topic of cultural influence with a specific mention of the 7 cultural mountains. So let's begin. We begin with a very foundational scripture that deals with the Lord's Prayer that Jesus said in Matthew 6:10, "Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You see, Jesus' prayer is very simple. He wants whatever is in heaven to come on earth, for us to manifest that as his representatives on earth. You know, it's amazing how simple that prayer is and how simple the assignment is. Now, it's not so simple to implement the strategy. It says in John 1:3, all things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. He also says that in Ephesians 4:4-6, there is one body and one spirit, just as you were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. You see, Jesus is to be Lord over all the universe, and he gave us delegated authority to manifest his presence and power on earth. So whatever is in heaven, he desires to be on earth. There's no sickness in heaven, so he doesn't want sickness. There's no poverty in heaven, so he doesn't want poverty on earth. And so anything that's not in heaven should not be on earth, according to the Lord's Prayer. So what is the Seven Mountain Movement? Maybe you've never heard of that. And there are 7 areas that really define the culture: arts and entertainment, business, church, education, family, media, and government. And the way this came about was in 1975, Bill Bright with Campus Crusade for Christ and Lauren Cunningham from Youth with a Mission met each other for the first time, and it just so happened that God spoke to each of them that very week. And he said to them that if we're going to influence the culture for Christ, it's going to have to be through these 7 areas. Now, one of them called them mind molders, another called them gates, another called them just places of influence. Doesn't really matter what you call them. We call them mountains because of Isaiah 2:2, where the Lord talks about the mountains and the mountain of the Lord. But arts and entertainment, business, education, family, government, media, and religion, and some intertwine that with church. But the focus is that this is a strategy. It's not a religion. It's not dominionism. It's a strategy to bring Christ into these areas. And when we look at these 7 areas, we see that the family is a very foundational part of this, because this is where the emotional health of the individual resides, and the well-being of the family. And there's a family on each of these cultural mountains. And then there's the media and education and arts and entertainment. These are areas that often define our worldview and our beliefs and our values. We've seen this mountain affected greatly in just the last 10 years in how it's shaping what people are believing and not believing. Fake news in media has become a word that we're all familiar with because of what's been taking place in more the liberal side of media that's really not projecting truth in all aspects of what we see. And then there's government. You know, government is where we develop and interpret our laws and enforce those laws. And then business, where prosperity and economy reside. And of course the church, where we really seek to have God and morality and values reflected and promoted. Isaiah 2:2 tells us that now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow to it. And so that's where we get the concept of the mountains of the Lord. You see, Jesus should be Lord over all domains of influence. He's the King of Kings, the Lord of Justice. He's Jehovah Jireh, the Lord of Economics. He's the Father, the Lord of the family. He's the Creator God, Lord of Science and Technology. He's the living Word, the Lord of Communication. He's the Potter, the Lord of the Arts and Beauty. And of course, he's the great teacher, Lord of Education. My good friend Landa Cope came up with that in her book, Old Testament Template, and what a great way of expressing the domains of influence that our Lord has. So Abraham Kuyper once said, "Oh, no single piece of our mental world is to be hermetically sealed off from the rest, and there's not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine.'" Oh, how beautiful that is if we could only have some politicians and leaders today that would reflect that. Unfortunately, America is in a deep crisis. We are in a stage where it's very dangerous, where we could not potentially recover from what we're in. And if there's not a turn in our nation, a revival of a change of heart in our nation, we are in danger of losing it all. You see, it all happened because of several tipping points in the country, and it began with disobedience, like it always does in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 28 talks about blessing and cursing, and whenever you are being obedient to the Lord, there's blessing that comes with that. But when you're disobedient, also come curses, and we're seeing those curses and more showing up in our nation. And so this is the place of beginning for us, and to understand where we've gone wrong. Well, back in 1857, and the National Education Association came along, and that's where we began to see the liberalization of the nation. You see, early in our pioneer days, our children were educated by the New England Primer. For 200 years, they read a small book called the New England Primer, and in that primer were scripture verses. They would learn to read and write based on reading scriptures. And our founding fathers and the pilgrims came to America to establish a Christian nation. Don't let anybody tell you differently. That is how we were formed, and that was the vision for America. And then in the 1930s, we saw that we abandoned Hollywood. Back then, many of the producers and writers and execs in Hollywood were asking churches to send them their people, but they said, "No, we don't want anything to do with that wicked film industry," and so we gave over Hollywood. And then in 1953, the very first Playboy magazine came along, and that's where anything goes sex was introduced into our country, and we began to see more and more promiscuity. We saw Woodstock and a rebellion of the 60s generation, and that ushered in a whole area of sexual promiscuity. And then, of course, in 1963, we saw prayer removed from schools, and that's when we began to see our test scores begin to go down, and violence in schools began to grow. And it was a direct correlation between the time where we kicked God out of the school and the consequence of that. And then in 1973, we saw Roe versus Wade, and that was a very strategic time in our nation where we began to kill the unborn, and devastating over 60 million babies killed through abortion. And then in 1997, we saw the gay agenda, with the very first public kiss in our nation on national television. And this opened up a whole new area where the gay initiative began to take root in our nation. And then in the year 2000, our young people adopted relativism. Relativism just says that anything goes as long as it doesn't affect me. And we began to see young people not able to make decisions based on absolutes. They were very influenced in the educational system, especially on the universities, where you could no longer have a belief system that had a basis of absolutes. And then we saw the Supreme Court in 2015, and where we saw the family impacted so greatly. And this is where we saw gay marriage approved, and we really went from being a moral government to a civil government. And so that's where we see ourselves today, and how we've gradually moved to a secular state versus a moral. The good news is there's still a remnant in America that can shift this things by our prayers and by standing in the gap. Ezekiel 22:30 talks about that God was looking for a man or a woman who would stand in the gap, that he might not destroy the culture. And so over these decades of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 2000s, we've seen socialism and bigotry and free speech being attacked. We've seen more and more Christian persecution. We've seen the idea of fake news for the first time, where we see that news is no longer reporting accurate facts, but there's an agenda to the news. And then we see campus intolerance on our universities, and it's really hard to have a Christian conservative voice in that arena. So we are seeing more and more incivility, and so this is where we're going, and more lying taking place in media, in government, in just about every aspect of life. Well, culture, we've discovered, is defined by only 3 to 5% of leadership at the top of a cultural mountain. What I'm saying is that we've learned over the years that it doesn't take many people to actually shift the cultural sphere with the right people at the top of that sphere. In fact, even in the foundation of America, Randall Collins, who wrote the book Discovery of Society, a sociologist, he's a secular sociologist, and he says U.S. culture has been defined by less than 500 intellectual cultural philosophers who influenced 7 gates and supporting networks since our birth as a nation. You see, it only takes a small percentage to shift a country. And the best case study we have of that is the gay rights movement. They've really, they're really a case study of using the 7 cultural mountains to shift an entire population's view of an issue from being a moral issue to being a civil issue. Now, if I asked you what percentage of the population is gay, I wonder what you might say. Would you say 20%, maybe 30%, maybe 10%? You may not even know that, but because of the influence that they've had, the percentage that people perceive them to have is much greater, when their actuality of the percentage of the gays is somewhere between 2.5% to 4.5%, depending on the research that you look at. And, just think about that this small percentage of people has totally shifted America's view from being a moral issue, which all believers know that it is a moral issue, to being a civil issue. Back in 1987, there was a book that came out after there was a gay activist meeting in Virginia, and 175 gay activists came together. They were led by 2 Harvard attorneys for that meeting. What came out of that was a book called After the Ball, how America will conquer its fear and hatred of gays in the 90s. And so they developed a strategy on how to shift America's view of their issue. Well, they first started out by trying to have these gay parades, and they were flaunting their gayness, and they realized that that really didn't work very well for them. And so they stepped back and reconsidered their ways and began a new strategy. Now, one of the interesting things, though, that's in this book is that they admit that gays are not born gay. Now, look at this quote right out of their own playbook. We argue that for all practical purposes, gays should be considered to have been born gay, even though sexual orientation for most humans seems to be the product of a complex interaction between innate predispositions and environmental factors during childhood and early adolescence. Now, did you hear that? They just said no one is born gay. It's a predisposition. due to environmental factors during childhood and early adolescence. Now, we as believers know that because we know that most people that are gay have some type of wound from a father, usually, that has affected them. If you really dig down in every person's gay, every gay person's life, you'll really discover that. Now, I'm not against gay people. I'm just against them trying to portray a lie to the public about an issue that's really, the truth of it. The central issue that we're dealing with is it's a choice, which makes it a moral issue and a lifestyle preference. And so they're in denial of the truth that someone is not born gay. And so that's how they've turned it into a civil issue when they proclaim that they're born gay. That's why they try to make it a civil issue, because if they could only deal with this on a moral issue, they can't deal with it on a civil issue. They can't stand the ground with that, and they can't get government to really see their side of it, because then it's not a civil rights issue, it's a moral issue. So the entire premise is built on a lie. But America has bitten this fish hook, line, and sinker, and we've allowed it to propagate, and they've done an excellent job in doing it. And they're radical. We're going to remove God from this society, is basically their attitude. And we're going to force you to accept our lifestyle. And you're going to have to make the laws support our lifestyle. We're going to get the benefits of everybody else. And so this is where we are today in our culture. I like what Rush Limbaugh said a few years ago. He said, how is it that 1 million gay activists can bully the rest of the country into their agenda? How is it that 70% of the population who do not agree with this lifestyle, those who identify as Christian, can be bullied to accept the gay lifestyle? His answer is they're organized, they're united, and they're sold out to their message, and they're well-funded with a strategy. Unfortunately, Christianity is not doing any of this, and that's why we're losing the culture war. So, how did they do it? Well, one of the first things they did is they went into arts and entertainment, and they got roles in sitcoms and movies. They started writing scripts. You see, the arts and entertainment industry is dominated by gay people, especially in the creative area. And so that's why we're seeing more and more lifestyle programming that leans toward gay issues. Disney is adopting this. Netflix is adopting this. And you will not find many creative people in Hollywood that are not gay. And that's why we're losing that cultural mountain. And then in the media, we began to see anchors who are gay. CNN has 2 anchors that are prominent gay people, and they don't mind saying they are. And I've heard one of them say, I know I was born that way. Here again, propagating the lie. And so media helps to support their message. And then government. We've seen lobbyists and gay lawyers go in and legislate and get laws changed to the point that we now have approved gay marriage in America as the law of the land. And then education, they've gone in and had things done in textbooks. They've got into early education. They even have people in libraries talking about the gay lifestyle, sex education. They've gotten it into there. And so they're basically reframing the argument every turn. And then business. Business has adopted this whole agenda, and they've created, affinity groups within businesses that are gay. They have gay pride months and so forth. And so businesses has really taken this on and supported their cause. And of course, family. It's affecting the family in very powerful ways. And, if it continues, we're just going to see the continual eroding of the family structure as we have known it. And of course, the church, many denominations now endorse the gay lifestyle in churches. And we even see gay priests and certain denominations. We see the Lutheran Episcopal churches breaking off over this issue. And so, as you can see, they have done a masterful job in winning the argument in the culture. They've also been supported by something called the Thunder Road strategy that, George Soros has been very key to this, giving billions of dollars to form all these left-wing organizations designed to destroy the family structure. And that's what we're seeing in our nation today. $18 billion had been raised as of 2019, forming organizations and strategies to defeat Christian causes, defeat conservatism in America. So, what are some strategies we can do around this one issue? Let's take a look at 10 core strategies that we can employ to fight this. The first thing we need to do is form our culture-shaping committees and groups that come together to develop strategies for influence. I call them the Culture Shaper Alliance groups, and under all of these 7 cultural mountains. And these groups need to come together to strategize and say, how do we bring revival into these areas? How do we raise up godly people as careers in these areas to begin to retake some of that we've lost? And then we need personal transformation. It can't happen without a personal revival in America. We can't just change people's opinions by argument. It's got to be a move of God in our nation. And that begins with personal transformation. Romans 12:2 says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We need to engage the culture through dialogue. We need to be able to connect with people that differ from us. To influence the culture, we must understand. To influence the culture, we must understand the viewpoints of those who see things differently than us. You see, Jesus calls us to love our enemies, not necessarily agree with them. Jesus didn't agree with the tax collector's business practices. Colossians 4:6 tells us, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. So don't be scared of getting into dialogue with people who differ from you. Number 3 is we need a biblical theology of work taught in churches. You see, there's no other institution that gathers people that are in the 7 cultural mountains than the local church. Unfortunately, the church has failed miserably in this area. Pastors are not equipping leaders in the church to see their work as a calling and a ministry unto themselves. They spend too much of their time building programs and trying to get us to do their ministry in the local context of the local congregation versus out there in the culture. And I'm telling you, this is one of the great needs of our culture today, that pastors need to make a major shift in this area. And then educate the next generation. We need 7M careers taught and encouraged our young people to go into these areas if we want to see salt and light represented in those areas. Unfortunately, very few young people are taught to see their work and calling as a ministry unto the Lord. And this is, again, where we're failing at the local church level. Number 5 is we need to serve the community by solving problems through the church in the city. You see, if churches would just band together and go to the mayor and say, what's your greatest problem, and roll up their sleeves and begin to influence that problem, this thing could be solved very shortly. And unfortunately, we lack unity. And because of the lack of unity, we won't come together in order to impact our cities. Number 6 is we need to develop key influencer strategies by mountain. As I mentioned in the opening slide there of these 10 things, we need to form these groups of 7 cultural spheres and develop strategies. We need to be part of a network. I'm pleased to announce this new app called Commissioned. And Commissioned is going to be a great tool for you to join other groups in the 7 cultural areas to be able to employ and engage the culture, to identify like-minded people who want to walk together in these areas. I encourage you to go to the website becommissioned.com and sign up for the app. You'll find it on the Apple Store as well as Google Play. And then you need to support worthy organizations and initiatives that are making a difference. We have a problem in philanthropy today that we're not matching funds with organizations that are really making a difference. And so I would encourage you to find those organizations that are making a difference, that are really speaking into the culture and being salt and light in the culture. That's what we need you to do. We need conferences and training to cast the vision. In 2019, I hosted the International Culture Shapers Summit. We brought 50 culture shaper leaders together to impart into these leaders an understanding of what it means to shape the culture. And then, of course, number 10, which should be number 1, move at a new dimension with God. We need to pray. 2 Chronicles 7:14 gives us our instruction. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. That's a promise from God. So I want to encourage you to embrace those 10 strategies. And if you want to go deeper in the conversation, I'd love to do that with you. One of the ways we can do that is to model William Wilberforce, what he did. He created something called the Clapham Group. There were about 18 individuals that came together, and they used their time, talent, and treasure to impact their culture. They abolished slavery after 30 years of work together, and they had 69 world-changing initiatives that not only impacted England, but the world. And so we're creating that same model through the Change Agent Master Mentor Program, where we're bringing leaders together. We meet together monthly over online. People from all over the world are coming together. We're equipping our leaders through this program, over 55 courses, 140 individual classes, a monthly coaching call, and a monthly prayer call. And so if you want to go deeper, let me encourage you to come join us in the Change Agent Master Mentor Program. We have a 7-session mastermind course on the 7 mountains. We just barely touched the surface on this topic today. If you want to go deeper, let me encourage you to go on the site, camastermentor.com, and join us. It's only $19 a month. That's incredible. There's $30,000 worth of training on that site. So we made it cheap, so that anyone could afford it. And just some tremendous resources. You get a bunch of free downloads just for signing up. So let me encourage you to go to camastermentor.com to join us. We'd love to get to know you and come together as an army to begin making a difference in the culture. So that's it for today. God bless you, and I hope to see you in one of our calls on the Master Mentor Program. Take care, and God bless.